Hello, and welcome to another edition of From the Bookshelf. The premise of our program is really quite simple. We believe that careful reading and careful discussion, reflection on quality writing can enable and provide the opportunity for people to see deeper into their lives and perhaps gain an insight into what's happening around them that might otherwise not be noted. The format of our show is also quite simple. Each time we gather, I'll bring to the table a book or perhaps one or two books that will provide the focus for discussion today. People all around are talking about a book which has been on the New York Times bestseller list for many, many weeks. And it's been written about and reviewed and talked about. And the book today we're dealing with is called Angela's Ashes. The author is Frank McCourt. The subtitle of the book is a memoir, for it is indeed the autobiography of Frank McCourt as he grew up from early, and I really mean early childhood, to young adulthood, and then he came to America. So the first 18, 19 years of his life spent in the town of Limerick, Ireland, are recounted in this book. And so we'd like to discuss it with you and see if this writing perhaps can give us and you, the audience, again, perhaps new insight into things around us. Now, let me pause first and introduce to you our guest today, Father Peter Walsh. Peter's a native of the Boston area, Dorchester, growing up?
Yes, and Milton.
And now Milton. His folks, his family is living in Milton. Peter was ordained into the priesthood for the Holy Cross community. He's involved, working very hard in the doctoral program at Boston College, where he's studying English literature.
English, well, right now we're focusing on American Lit.
American Lit.
And Irish.
I'm delighted to have Peter here with me. Before we just launch right into the book and the story here, there's one little preface I might make in terms of a remark, and I'm going to ask Peter to see if I'm off on the deep shoulder, off the road here a bit. But when I read other books like Tolstoy, who writes from a very different point of view also, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, Charles Dickens with Tale of Two Cities, very often the first paragraph or two, at least the first page, is very important. Mm-hmm. It's important in any piece of writing. Even when we do homilies at church, it's that first few sentences that will either bring people in or they'll turn us off. Mm-hmm. And I think, too, in writing, the first few lines can give us an inkling as to what will be coming up next. In Anna Karenina, it talks about families, unhappy families and happy families. In Tale of Two Cities, Dickens writes about it was the best of times and it was
the worst of times.
The worst of times. I'm terrible in quotes. But I think quality writing and writing novels is a craft that really few people are up to. Let's take a look, Peter, just a bit at the first page or two, because it's almost as if in this first page we see a mountain, and this is page 11 in the book here, a mountain of information that we could talk about. Again, McCourt, born in Brooklyn, New York, and that's a story unto itself. But then his family moves back to Ireland because they're just unable to make it in America for different reasons. And so when he looks back at his childhood, gosh, here's this quote, which I think is a way to set the context. And McCourt says, "It was, of course, a miserable childhood. The happy childhood is hardly worth your while. Worse than the ordinary miserable childhood is the miserable Irish childhood. And worse yet is the miserable Irish Catholic childhood." And it goes on with a paragraph about poverty. Peter, how does it strike you? I know, again, you know, you're doing serious work and reading and writing, and you have a background that maybe will resonate better than mine. How did that paragraph strike you?
Well, in a lot of ways, he moves from the very general into the more increasingly particular details about his story. And I think that that's what you were saying before about any reader being able to pick up the book and find areas that resonate, and then find areas that are different, that are strange allusions, etc., that deal more particularly with, say, the Irish part of his background or the Catholic part of his background. But that he sort of entices the reader into his story by creating a universal about happiness and unhappiness, but then setting up the parameters in which he's going to tell his story by talking about a very specific ethnic group or a national group and a very specific kind of religious upbringing. None of these are unfamiliar to most Americans because of especially in the Boston area, so many Irish and Irish Catholics living around here. And the way in which he plays off of some of those stereotypes or those common features of Irish background and Catholic background is what makes this book so, I think, charming and also challenging to a lot of people. So it's a nice way, in a narrative way, for him to sort of include us and yet also usher us into a story that some of us will find pretty horrifying in certain features and others will find kind of nostalgic.
Yeah.
So it's a very heavily worked beginning. It's not I was born in, which is the way in which we'd expect an autobiography or a memoir to begin.
Yeah. And then he immediately tells us about the climate. And again, that's a part of, obviously, the situation. And for you folks who either were from Ireland or know about it, have visited, will again resonate with this. But he talks about, in this next to last paragraph, above all, he says, we were wet. But then, again, his style is so, to me, interesting. I could not envision my being able to write like this with the sort of tools he has with words. I'm a word person myself, but not at this level. And he uses, I think, it can be daunting to some people, and there are places where if you don't have some background, you may just sort of miss the flow. For example, he says, in trying to talk about the fact that it's wet all year round. Well, as you say, he doesn't just say all year round it's wet. What does he say? The rain dampened the city from the Feast of the Circumcision to New Year's Eve.
And that's something that, you know, for a lot of Catholics born after the Second Vatican Council, they won't get that joke at all, because you have to remember when the Feast of the Circumcision was celebrated, which is
January 1.
January 1st, right? Now it's called it's a feast in honor of Our Lady, Mary, Mother of God. And so some people might have to do a little bit of digging in order to get his humor. But again, it's that type of play with language that makes this, I think, an extraordinary memoir, and in some ways kind of typically Irish, because the Irish are so well known for language and for playing with language.
Here's another quote, which again I'd like to see if you can kind of help us with. And I struggle with this myself, because how can one talk in terms of the whole poverty issue and what was happening? And then he decides to go back and tell the reader. Obviously, he has to have done some research and talk to people because he wasn't there. But he speaks about, and this is on page 13, the next page, he says at the bottom of the page, my mother's troubles began the night she was born. Now, what a way to kind of set the stage for all that is to come. And do you think that's a tip-off in terms of her own the fact that his mother had many, many children and many, many difficulties?
I think it is. I mean, it's kind of a literary technique of talking about star-crossed or fated beginning from the moment of birth, and you see that a lot in novels. I think people might find it a little funny to see that in a genre that we would expect to be more factual. And in some ways and that's where this book really crosses the line between fiction and nonfiction all the time. But definitely, where birth plays such an important role in the book, and difficult births, including his mother's, and then all of her subsequent, all the times that she gives birth are difficult and painful, and dealing with malnourishment, it definitely sets up something that becomes a paradigm on how difficult life was from the beginning.
And it certainly was difficult all the way through. one of the things he speaks about, too, without going back to that first page, is he talks about the Irish situation and an alcoholic father and a loquacious, I think he uses the word loquacious father, who was wonderful in the way that he could bring in his children, his sons, and let me tell you this story, and that was wonderful. I think that was one of the marvelous memories that McCourt has about growing up, that his father would take the time not to work,
No.
but to tell stories. And so I guess that's the real genre here.
And so, you mentioned that obviously he's describing events that he himself would not have witnessed, his parents' birth, his mother's birth, their meeting, etc. And I think that part of that is that ongoing storytelling that, you know, later on in the story when they're back in Limerick and living in a tenement and they're kind of huddled together in an upper room because the lower room is flooded by the sewage that comes into the house. What are they doing up there? But they're telling stories. And that in a lot of ways, this is a nice example of oral storytelling that's been very effectively put into prose.
And, you know, just as a diversion, many people will talk to us and say, in the Bible, in the Gospels, how do we know that this person said exactly that? Well, we can ask the same question here. If McCourt writes this book at this point in his life and describes for us a conversation that the priest has with another person at his baptism.
That's right, yeah.
I don't think we had a recording of that conversation.
No, we didn't. And that's in some ways he's really exposing something that in a lot of ways all of history is fiction, and that we look for a factual telling of things, but just by putting it into story form, we're really taking data and turning it into something else. And that in a lot of ways he's pretty upfront, I think, by doing that, saying this is my telling of my story. You're not going to find perhaps absolute facts about how things went, but you get a wonderful story about his life nonetheless.
And yet that's really the I don't want to say miracle, but the genius of him is to use the conversation in the dialect with which later on he grew up and could really give us back to. But taking over maybe 20 years, learning dialect and learning mannerisms, and then projecting back, perhaps, I would think, projecting back and saying, this is what he must have said in these words.
That's right. And of course there probably would have been fragments that he remembered from what his parents talked about. But if you heard any of the interviews with Frank McCourt around the time that this book really hit the top of the charts, and he alluded to that when he first wrote the memoir decades ago, he wrote it as people would expect a teacher of writer to write it, with very kind of difficult, turgid prose and very heavy language, and it went nowhere. So he had to reclaim a voice. He had to create a voice that would tell the story better. And what he does is, by telling it from the perspective of a young child in a very heavy dialect of Anglo-Irish, and yet at the same time with adult observations. So it's a very kind of complicated narrator here.
You know, something, again, because of my ignorance or background, but we chatted earlier, he uses the, I'll call it language or the use of words in a way that's not as familiar to me as it might be to you. For example, in talking about the weather, perhaps he'll say, I might say to you, it's damp outside. He will say, the damp.
Right.
Or rather than going to a place to have a little refreshment and so forth, and we would say, I need a pint, or I need a drink. And, you know, he talks about his father, others getting the pint. How is that, you know, common, the use of THE?
Oh, it's very, very common. In fact, when I would read it, I'd hear in the background my grandmother saying, you know, before dinner, I'm starving with the hunger. You know, it's just absolutely common in Irish speech. And I don't know the Irish language well enough to refer back to that, but I'm sure that it's something in the translation that happened 150 years ago from Ireland being an Irish-speaking country to an English-speaking country, and that because the translation from language to language was done at a very grassroots level, proper or standard English didn't become the language of most people. It's a dialect, and it includes a lot of grammatical and linguistic features of Old Irish.
Well, that's good for me to know, because so his use of the pint is not his use in terms of his constructing something.
That's right.
But he's giving us what is common to the people of that time.
That's right,
Yeah.
and common to Irish people now.
Right.
I mean, it's very much a heavily inflected language.
Right.
And but then again, he is giving it to us because he knows that he's marketing this book kind of for an American audience. And being an American citizen and a resident of the state since he was 19, he certainly uses standard English in other ways.
Yeah.
But here, it's a creative voice that's being shown to its fullest in that sense. Yeah.
I mentioned earlier too the feeling I had that, gee, I wish I had read this book 35 years ago, and I still think about that, and that's exactly right. On another note, little expressions and say, what did they really mean? And I've heard an expression which I'm going to bring up in a second many, many times over the years, and I thought I understood the subtlety of it, but I now know I really didn't. And I remember more than one time at a wake, you're standing in line and people are filing by, and there's all kinds of just chemistry, that's my word, going on in a room, a funeral home with a wake and people and so forth. And it's awfully difficult. I know, Peter, you and I, we go to somebody and who knows what to say.
Yeah.
I mean, there really is nothing. I mean,
you're more concerned about not knowing what to say than
words just. And so one time I'm in the line and all these, to me, strangers. I think I knew them by face, but not by really like who they were, and that's often the case. And they come one by one and say, sorry for your troubles. And later on, the kids and I were saying, what does that mean? What does that mean,
Yeah.
And so, if I just quickly, I'm sure it's other places too, but in the book here, McCourt says, describing something, well, she says, sorry for your troubles, and I hope that all you'll ever have. And I guess it's sort of a common, like, almost parenthetical remark.
That's right. It's and exactly for reasons like that, because in some ways words can never capture tragedy to the full extent, and you're always nervous when you're dealing with someone who's in sorrow, because you realize that, and that there's everything that you say is going to sound trite. So there are these stock phrases that people use that convey a multitude of compassion and sympathy.
So it's almost code in one sense.
It is code, exactly.
Yeah. Interesting how we use that, and But again, if I were in West Lynn, that'd be a whole nother, kind of code, and
that's right.
That's what kind of throws people off a bit. It's very interesting. He talks about, again, this may be even more common ground for us to use that phrase too, and I think all children, whatever culture in which they grow up, ask questions because kids are naturally curious.
Right.
And the younger, the more curious. And, the more questions asked, the adults say, will you stop asking questions? And so there's this gap between the parent or the adult and the kids who are asking the questions. There's this wonderful thing, I think it's on page 108, just to kind of draw attention to it. But he's asking his father questions and so forth. And in the top of the page it says, Dad says, I'll understand when I grow up. And again, just to give the viewers a touch of the language here, he tells me that all the time now, and I want to be big like him so that I can understand everything. This is the quote I think is wonderful. It must be lovely to wake up in the morning and understand everything. Kind of that kid's way of saying, I keep asking these questions. My father says, wait, you'll soon know. There's going to be this magic day when you wake up and it's all there. Then, the remark that his father says, well, no, when I don't have a good answer for you, it's a mystery.
Yeah, and I think any child can relate to that comment, or especially anybody with a Catholic background, that everything unexplainable becomes a mystery.
If I can't explain it, well, it's a mystery. So not to worry about it, right? You learn soon enough.
Exactly.
Peter, maybe on a personal, we're talking, kind of picking apart some of the language here, but as you read it, did it kind of bring back any memories from your folks, your grandparents or family, and say, oh yeah, I've heard a similar story before?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it brought up two different stories for me, because what makes this book different as far as Irish literature goes is that it's a very different story of Irish poverty. That my grandparents, for instance, came from the west of Ireland in Galway, both sets of my grandparents, and they had a very difficult upbringing. It was in the period at the end of British rule and at the beginning of the final burst of troubles that created the Irish Free State. And but it's a very classic story of the rural Irish poor struggling out in a 3-room cottage with a big family. This is not that. This is an urban poor. And in a lot of ways, it mirrored my parents' experience, both families being immigrant families to the United States during the Depression. And in a lot of ways, I think Americans could read this and resonate more with their parents or grandparents who lived through the Great Depression. Perhaps not with the utter destitution that you find here, but certainly with the difficulties that had upon family structures and just the sense of well-being that children need. But so that in this way, it really breaks one mold that the Irish poor are the noble rural peasant, and brings us into an Irish urban area that's equally poor, but that doesn't have all the magic and nostalgia that Americans are used to seeing. And so in that sense, it could increase a sense of like second and third generation Americans' compassion for people who are living in blighted areas in our cities now. But in a lot of ways, this story is similar to what goes on in American cities now, and that for Irish Americans to look back and to say, well, that was our story just 1 or 2 generations ago, I think it can give them a very good boost in a way of understanding the way urban poverty affects people. In other words, that it's poverty. It's not ethnicity that causes a lot of these problems.
Yeah. I hope I haven't stressed or overstressed too much the fact that this is a particular culture as opposed to, but I mean, it does give us an example of something.
Yeah. He does both. He does the particular culture very well, but he's also exposing it as a problem of poverty. And if you, in Irish history at this period in the 30s and 40s was, you know, after having moved from into the Free State and with the Civil War, it was a very destitute country, just like any emerging nation in a post-colonial period, and has all of the difficulties that countries that we now see as post-colonial countries had.
Maybe to extend that and say, you know, it can come out of a particular culture and or be very universal. I think sometimes too of the difficulties that, again, Frank had growing up. His situation was horrible from one point of view. And yet, his father, who was, as he says, an alcoholic, couldn't hold a job, et cetera, and eventually abandoned the family. And yet, for some way, you have the sense, at least I have the sense, that he really loved his dad.
Yeah, definitely.
And kind of how does that transcend all the detail of negative, he didn't do this right, but I love him. And maybe in the inner cities we can see how other people can have the same sort of affection for a missing dad. Or
that's right, and in a lot of ways the absent father is the one that he yearned for more. One of the criticisms of the book that I've read is that he very much romanticizes the absent bumbling father who causes the poverty in a lot of ways because of his inability to deal with alcohol and to deal with life. And in a lot of ways, he vilifies his mother in a crucial scene towards the end. I think later on the mother is recuperated a bit, but the young boy becomes very angry with her and blames her and separates from her. And that has aggravated a lot of people, that he, you know, the one who sticks with the children gets vilified, and the one who abandons them is remembered nostalgically and heroically.
I was struck too with a bit of a puzzle, and I still don't have a good feeling in my mind, but just the title as we begin, Angela's Ashes. What do you take for that title?
Well, in a lot of ways it's a misnomer, because you expect the memoir to deal with the mother. And it does, but the mother is so passive, and that's that's really the spin on it, that the ashes of what she's staring at all the time in the fireplace. And it's, you know, that can become a trope of her own life in ashes, and any hopes that she would have had just burned away into cinders in the fireplace. But it's an interesting way of bringing in a mother who is so desperate and passive and can't seem to pull life together.
Yeah. And do you suppose that has any bearing on what I referred to earlier, like that first line, my mother's troubles began the day she was born, like she began with this whole, you know.
That's right,
burden.
and she's never going to get out of it, it seems.
Yeah.
You know, now we don't know the sequel, but he's working on it, and we'll know more of the mother's story when he comes out with the next book.
Again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I see in books is that the first page sets us with a definitive framework for things, as McCourt did. And if I look at Tolstoy, as he began talking about families, but then he began to wrap up, and at the end he's talking about church, and again closing a thing. In The Tale of Two Cities, what does Dickens do but end with a wonderful story, but then Sidney Carton's great line, "'Tis a far, far better place I go, 'tis a far, far better thing I do." So we have a beginning, the world, it was a great world and not so great, and then this is what's going on. But I think, as you indicate, McCourt is about to do something else. Well, we're running out of time. Peter, I want to thank you for your conversation, insight, and we'll see you again on another edition.